Hey everyone, welcome to this webinar, and Happy New Year to everyone. I hope it's not too late to say that already. So it's the third AquaVitae monthly webinar, these Low Trophic Life webinars that we've been running for a little while now, and we're really happy today to have a guest speaker. So we're really looking forward to that. So it's Jean-Baptiste Thomas from KTH in Sweden. So I'll give the word over to him in a little bit, but first I want to say hi to our project coordinator, obviously, as usual. Hi, Phil, welcome.
Hi, Emil, and everybody.
Right, so Phil, could you run us through a little bit about the project itself?
Yep, sure. So at the start of each of these webinars, Emil just asked me to say a few words about AquaVitae, since we have quite a diverse audience, and it's good just to give a very brief outline at the beginning. So AquaVitae is a Horizon 2020 project. It's a 4-year project. We're 18 months into the project now. We've got 35 partners, which include universities, research institutes, small and medium businesses, and then large businesses as well. And on top of the 35 actual partners in the project, we have stakeholders numbering around about 165 that are also participating. So it's a large project. We cover 4 different continents all around the Atlantic, 16 countries. And the project itself is focusing on supplying food from the ocean in a sustainable way through increasing the production specifically of low trophic species all across the Atlantic. So that covers 5 different value chains. We have 11 different case studies, 2 cross-cutting case studies, and 9 work packages looking at everything from the profitability of different low trophic species to sustainability and how we monitor that and how we measure it. So it's a great pleasure today to listen to the talk of JB, especially on LCAs of low trophic species. I think that's a really interesting topic, and I really look forward to hearing all about it.
Thanks, Phil. Right, so let me just go ahead then and introduce JB, which is the abbreviation of Jean-Baptiste, obviously. So JB, he's a postdoc at KTH in Sweden. He will present, obviously, on the life cycle assessment of low trophic species in aquaculture, with a particular focus then on seaweed. And his research involves assessing the sustainability of seaweed, the seaweed industry that is developing now in Sweden. And his doctoral thesis, defended in June 2018 and contributing to the Sea Farm project, includes a wide range of analytical methods from environmental economics, social sciences, and industrial ecology, which together form a collection of insights on the sustainability of this Swedish seaweed industry. So, JB, welcome. You can unmute your mic now and say hi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I don't know how many people are here, but I don't see that. I'm seeing the presenter view here on my PowerPoint slides. But thank you for having me today, and thank you for the introduction.
No problem.
So shall I just jump right in here?
Go ahead, JB. And as always, I can just remind everyone that, as always, you can ask questions on the right. There's a little box there, and we'll go through any questions at the end of this presentation. Thanks.
So I'll just start with a quick footnote. I apologize ahead of time. I've been having some cold symptoms recently, so if I'm a bit sniffy, you know why. So this is today a presentation about one paper which is published and a series of papers which are, one of them is under review, and there are a few others which we're working on and are in the pipeline. So it's a work in progress. And as Emil mentioned, I'll be focusing a little bit on seaweed. A little bit more on seaweed than the others, but hopefully, if we have time, we'll present a few others as well. So this is a picture of the Nordic Sea Farm sugar cultivation site in the Koster Archipelago, which is on the Swedish west coast. You can see here this blue arrow is approximately where it's located. The site is a 2-hectare farm. It's been established for a little over 5 years now, I think 7 years. And it's located near a hatchery here, which is part of the University of Gothenburg Stjärne Sven Löfven Marine Labs, a mouthful, and drying and processing facility, which is also nearby, just out of picture around here. So the Nordic Sea Farm has just been rebranded from Koster Alg, and they've also recently been granted a 20-hectare license a little south of this site. So they will be scaling up rapidly in the coming years. So today's presentation will focus very much on the supply chain of this 2-hectare site. We will have follow-up studies in the coming years looking at the supply chain as it evolves and scales up. But for now, this is a first LCA, a benchmark, if you will, against which we can compare in future. Hopefully, as I mentioned, there'll also be time to go through some results from 3 other, though similar though less detailed LCAs, which have been submitted as part of a project that I'm working on with Åsa Strand. And quick shout out to Åsa, thank you for arranging my presentation today, if you're here. The first of these 3 cases is a large-scale blue mussel mariculture that's been ongoing on the West Coast for many years. The second is a pilot tunicate farm, also on the West Coast. And then the third case is this mussel aquaculture pilot in the Baltic. All the LCAs you see today are more or less limited to aquaculture practices only. So in LCA terms, they what we call cradle to gate, not cradle to grave, not a full systems perspective on the whole life cycle of these systems. It's just a snapshot into the aquaculture part of it. And the idea with these studies is that they were exploring impact hotspots of these aquaculture activities, but also looking at circular economy contributions, potential circular economy contributions of low trophic aquaculture in terms of nutrient recovery. And as I mentioned, full cradle to grave LCAs are on the way, looking at a wide range of application scenarios and within frameworks that'll allow comparison with other food products. So just some very quick things. You've been hearing the word LCA. I suspect there are some people here that are not familiar with it, so I'll just take a minute to explain it very quickly. LCA is a method that's been developing for over 10 years now. And what sets it aside from other environmental assessment methods is that it's looking at products or functions of products over their entire life cycle. So for paper mugs and mugs that you might use for coffee, for instance, it'll look at the raw material extraction, the manufacturing and production, distribution, operation and maintenance. So things like dishwasher cycles for this one here. And you might compare the function of 100 coffee cups or coffee portions and compare these 3 different alternatives here. And also, of course, the recycling and end of life management. So key thing about LCAs is that they compare functions of product or product systems, and it allows one to quantify environmental impacts across a range of impact categories, not just climate change or one other one. It's really quite a wide range of different impact categories, and this is facilitated by the method and the databases that are used for these assessments. So it really provides a bigger picture on environmental impacts that helps to inform optimization of supply chains and also decision making. So with that in mind, the paper today, you've got a link to it here. There's a little QR code if you're interested. It'll be in 1 or 2 other slides, and you'll also get PDFs of this, I think already uploaded to the teams. These are, this study is, as I mentioned, a cradle to gate. The functional unit, so the function of the system that's being assessed is the production and processing of 1 ton of fresh harvested kelp. And it compares different parts in the supply chain. So I'll present that in a moment. And for those LCA savvy people, it's using CML baseline method and cumulative energy demand. These are the 2 main methods that express the impacts across these 12 categories here, which include things like abiotic depletion, acidification, global warming potential, and so on. And I will focus, we don't have time to go through so much today, so I will focus on the ones that are interesting for low trophic aquaculture, which are eutrophication and global warming. So these are going to be surrounded by this little black box as we go through. So this is the system. Very simple diagram once you understand the flow. The idea is that we start with a hatchery, so the preparation of spores from a parent specimen. So that is the first step, and then we have different seeding methods to get these spores onto lines that can then be deployed to sea. The cultivation and harvesting processes are included, and then finally the biomass is preserved in 4 alternative ways. So I will split the results. I've split up the results into 3 parts: hatchery, cultivation and harvesting, and then processing. And then we'll see at the end a final graph which sums up everything together. So for those of you that aren't familiar with hatchery processes, it starts by selecting these parent specimen and developing this sorus tissue, isolating it, getting the spores to develop in a tank and then attach onto these lines. This is actually, there are two different ways of doing this, which we have called spray seeding and submersion seeding. In this case, you're seeing the results from the submersion seeding. These juvenile kelp attached to the rope, which is then deployed. You can see these PVC tubes here attached to the long line ropes. They're just dragged along, and then the seaweed uncoils itself around the rope. So this is how they're deployed. The main take-home messages from the hatchery are fairly simple, and overall the share of impacts of the hatchery relative to the rest of the supply chain were found to be relatively small. But the main impact hotspots were relating to the aquaria, the seeding lines, the collectors themselves, and the energy consuming processes, so the temperature control, aeration, and lighting. And those energy consuming processes are above the red lines in each case. So everything below the red lines are the material components, and everything above is energy consumption. Now you'll note the carbon emissions from here are relatively small in terms of energy consumption, and that's because the electricity production in Sweden is relatively low carbon. So this is a result that you'll see trending when it comes to energy use in this study. But again, it depends on where your hatchery is located and the type of energy mix that you have where you are situated. The next part was the cultivation and harvest. So this is an accurate representation of the farm, which is, again, 2 hectares, so 26 long lines that are 190 meters long. These squiggly lines mean continue as this, continue until you get to the full 200 meters. So, of course, included in this, these steps of the supply chain are the maintenance and monitoring of the long lines, the harvesting processes itself, and transporting back to shore. And, of course, all of the infrastructure involved in these operations. And again, just 2 simple take-home messages from here were that the ropes had a large contribution, a large share of the impacts. So these are the various types of ropes that are used in the system, and there you can see them here in the bracketed red. And also the chains, which are galvanized steel chains, which are used in the infrastructure itself, were also pretty significant in terms of their impact contributions, especially in the toxicity categories. Again, yeah, so then the preservation stages, so downstream again from the harvest, what do we do when we collect all of this seaweed? Well, in the Sea Farm project, there were a series of tests that were done at various scales for how to handle this biomass. So these are pictures of experiments or large-scale setups that have been become established since then that this paper is based on. So we have some hang drying outside, which actually nowadays is enclosed in a polytunnel. We have some ensiling experiments that were conducted. These will be represented by the C in the graphs on the next slide. Air drying indoors, we actually modeled an air dryer like this and associated impacts, so relatively energy intensive process. And again, another energy intensive process of freezing the biomass and putting it in cold storage. We include 90 days of cold storage in this study, which we assumed would be it's worth saying that of all of these preservation methods, the freezing one requires constant energy input the longer you store it. So we assumed 90 days limit here, and over 90 days you can see the impacts of the freezing case are the largest compared to the other ways of preserving the biomass. So freezing performs worse. The air cabinet drying was the second worst performing alternative, mainly because of the large amount of energy consumption and the stainless steel that's used in the machinery itself. The preservation methods with the lowest impact were found to be the outdoor hang drying. So this was very simple in terms of material and no constant energy or requirements for energy. It's more passive, closely followed by the ensiling process. Yes, and then you could also, again, highlight here that the trends are more or less the same across all of the impact categories. So summarizing back to this original graph, you see the color coding here, yellow and orange for the hatchery, dark and light green for the cultivation and harvesting, and then shades of blue for the preservation stages at the end. This is the overall impacts diagram. Now, to help you understand this, just again, we have all of the impact categories from the LCA, these 12 impact categories at the bottom from this method, focusing in on, eutrophication and global warming potential. You have the emissions and impacts are the 0 to 100, and all of these results are normalized to the worst performing case here, to the freezing. So they're all relative and can be compared this way. If you want the exact amounts of emissions, then please contact me, or you can look in the paper and you'll find them there. So everything from 0 to 100% are the emissions and associated impacts, and everything from 0 to minus 100% are the uptakes from the environment or associated impact mitigation. So the uptake of nitrogen and phosphorus, for instance, here causing a huge negative emissions, so actually uptake from the environment and an associated impact mitigation. And the same here for the global warming potential, so for carbon. Yep, so if those are the emissions and this is the uptake, then you can sort of understand that there's actually a net effect situation here that needs to be really the result. So when people talk about seaweed being the solution to all climate problems, which is something that you see in the press quite often, this study actually suggests that if you freeze the biomass at gate here, once it's been frozen, before it's even been distributed or sent to market or used in any way, it's approximately carbon neutral, which is relatively good performance compared to other food sources or other biomasses being used in the bioeconomy. But it's not carbon negative by any means. You can't, sell carbon credits along with a supply chain like this. The other alternatives perform still relatively well, and this is worth saying that this is a 2-hectare farm. It's not optimized. It's not really scaled up that much. There's a lot of opportunity to improve this, but the point is that in order to acquire seaweed, you have emissions within the system, and yes, this seaweed sucks out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and from the water. In this study, we account for that as climate benefits, and we're not looking at so much the carbon uptake from the water as a potential local acidification mitigation measure. But the point is that there is a balance here, and that in order to get the return of carbon credits, if you like, or carbon sequestered by the biomass, you also need to have emissions. So there's an investment in order to get a return on your carbon, if you want to use return on investment terms. So those are the main results here. So again, if you're interested in that study, please feel free to contact me. I think you have my email address already included in the invites that were sent out for this seminar. Now I'll quickly go over, I see I'm running out of time, so I'll very quickly breeze over the 3 other cases. So I've already presented to you case 1 here, the sugar kelp aquaculture on the West Coast. There's also the blue mussel aquaculture on the West Coast, in the Baltic as well, and then a Ascidian farming pilot case in the West Coast. So apologies for this complicated graph. I'm going to let those that work with LCA understand or interpret these as they will. The main thing here is these are not normalized to the worst performing. They're a different type of graph. Here you can actually see the eutrophication and climate impact potentials here, expressed in kilograms of phosphorus equivalent, or phosphate equivalent, sorry, and kilograms of CO2 equivalent. These studies, in order to compare to compare apples and oranges in LCA, or in this case, mussels, kelps, and tunicates, you have to use, well, it's advisable to use multiple functional units in parallel to broaden the context and make a fairer comparison. So for instance, the Ascidians are 95% water content. So if you look at their impacts per ton fresh, it's very, very low because there's so much mass, if you like. There are so many tons of the Ascidians being produced per rig. But if you look at the impacts per ton dry matter, suddenly it's a very different situation. And again, this is because of water content. So providing multiple functional units helps you to sort of provide a fairer comparison, a fairer picture of the situation. The key take home is that the 4 aquaculture systems perform quite similarly. None were particularly worse than the others. Kelp did have slightly higher climate impacts, but this was due to the hatchery and the associated energy use of the hatchery, whereas the other systems did not need hatcheries. In red at the bottom here are some key take-home messages based on the concept of return on investment again. So return on investment is this idea of, in order to get this biomass and the associated impact mitigations from the low trophic aquaculture that is going on, you have to invest emissions, so to speak, in order to get those returns. So if you look at nutrients invested and their return on their investment, you see that there's a very good return on investment in this cradle to gate perspective. So we're not looking at how those nutrients are used downstream yet. These are studies that are in the pipeline. This is very much just focusing on the aquaculture perspective, cradle to gate over very short time horizons. And again, the same here with the carbon. So you do have net carbon return on investment. So above 1 would mean it means that there is a return on investment. Below 1 would mean that you're not yet reaching break even. This is our ROI studies. Energy return on investments are also quite common indicators in energy studies. So in summary, nutrient ROIs were found to be very high, evidence that low trophic aquaculture can support circular economies for nutrients and closing the loop on nitrogen and phosphorus. And all case studies also performed well from a carbon perspective. But of course, we need to look at how this carbon and these nutrients, where they go downstream to get a full life cycle perspective on these product supply chains. So finally, in conclusion, just a couple of key take-homes. When it comes to seaweed, it's very important to think about how clean the energy supply is. In this model, it was found to be a relatively important factor. If we were producing the seaweed using European average electricity input data, the return on investment on carbon would be negative, so we wouldn't have a return on investment. There would not be a break-even situation there either. LCA is also in its infancy when it comes to aquaculture systems. There's a lot of data that's missing from these impact databases. Ropes, for instance, are not at all modeled yet. So there's a big need for this to develop, and it is starting. So this LCA and other LCAs you may see of aquaculture systems have to use proxies and estimates for parts of the supply chain that may or may not be important. In this study, for the ropes, for instance, we modeled them as fleece and made some adjustments to the systems there. So in the coming years, you can expect LCAs to get more reliable, but at this stage, they're indicative at best. And then downstream, the full life cycle assessment, the full cradle to grave impact comparisons of seafoods are also in the pipeline. This is something that's on the way. And then I thought I would also mention this for the carbon situation. Again, because of this hype that we hear about seaweed saving the climate, we're trying to write a paper at the moment, not really criticizing that seaweed can't save the climate. I think there can be many contributions to reducing overall emissions from society. But this is a tentative, it's a preliminary graph from a paper that we're developing at the moment, which is sort of going to explain the different aspects of different types of emissions or impact mitigations relating to carbon that happen in the full life cycle of marine biomass and kelp as a case study here. So of course, you know that carbon is fixed by the biomass by photosynthesis. We can assume that it's coming from the atmosphere, but a lot of it's actually coming from the water. So there's a dynamic here, which is relatively complex, and that needs to be, you need to set some clear assumptions there on how to handle it. Then there are, of course, the supply chain emissions, which I've just shown you up to market. Then at market, there's the substitution of other materials. So if you're eating a seaweed bean burger where 10% of the seaweed is actually 10% of the burger is actually a seaweed mix, then perhaps this is one additional vegetarian or possibly vegan product on the supermarket shelf that may offset somebody's choices. You may have somebody who's curious and wants to try a new product. Instead of getting a beef burger, they might try a seaweed burger, and then this is an avoided emission. So there are ways of accounting for the effects in the market and substitution and temporary storage during these timeframes, and the avoidance of fossil carbon or other carbon emissions, and also cascaded uses within the market. And then finally, of course, there's the end of life and the emissions. So we're trying to build a sort of a framework here for people to relate to when it comes to carbon flows in low trophic aquaculture. That's all I had for you today. So thank you. I would love to answer your questions if there are any.
Thanks, JB. Excellent presentation. I love that you stick to the time as well, even though your presentation was quite complex, especially for someone like me who's not an expert in any of this. I'm just the host. I'm supposed to have no knowledge about anything, ain't I? Anyway, so there's a question that came in actually already in the middle, and I think you may have answered it towards the end, but I'll still ask it anyway. And it's Peter. He's wondering if the multiple usage of long line ropes and chains are accounted. So he writes that his point is ropes and chains can sustain for multiple production seasons and then lead to multiple tons of kelp biomass.
Yes, Peter, thank you for your question. Yes, so we have assumed a life expectancy for each item accounted for in the LCA. The ropes, I believe, are specifically assumed to last 5 years, and we have done sensitivity analysis on this with plus or minus 50% on that life expectancy. And there's also the cleaning of the ropes is included in the study, so removing the holdfasts and the stems and so on. The chains are assumed to last 10 years, I believe. And we've also done sensitivity there, playing around with different materials for the chains, so stainless steel, galvanized steel, and so on, and also reducing their amount. So we've played around with this, and really these results are faithful to the design of the farm that's installed there now. And again, the idea was to have a relatively unoptimized. I mean, they're mindful of these things because they've been aware of the LCA results as they've come through. The guys who've been designing the farm and operating it, but they are now in the process of scaling up with these results in mind, and they will be trying to reduce those impacts. So it'll be interesting to do a follow-up LCA of the new farms as they're installed in the coming years, especially once we've seen how management of these farms changes and the transport distances change and so on as they scale up over 20 hectares further down the coast.
Thanks, JB. Right, so I'll stick to seaweed. There's plenty of questions that would come in, but I'll stick to seaweed just for now. So there's one question that is, there's no name there, but it's, doesn't the carbon being taken from the water by seaweed reduce the concentration of dissolved carbon in the water and increase CO2 flux from the atmosphere?
Yes, absolutely. That would be the assumption that we're basing ourselves on when we're saying that this is having a net negative climate effect. So when it's mitigating the impacts or climate impacts. So that is exactly, you phrased it perfectly, much better than I have in the past. So thank you for that. I'll try to look up that question later and paraphrase you when I'm presenting this in future. So thank you.
All right, I'll keep the question a hand for you afterwards. Right, so there's a question from Mercedes. She asks if you could comment a little bit on the performance of the mussel farms. And do you need to show your slide again, or just?
Yeah, I can go back to it. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
The mussels, I guess the mussels east versus west are a little bit different. The two production systems. So the East Coast, which our east and west in Sweden are not the same as what most people would think in terms of the US, for instance. So East Coast is Baltic. This is a pilot. So number 3 is just a small pilot site where they're using these, I think they refer to them as Christmas tree lines from New Zealand. And they've actually had some quite good harvests just in the last couple of years. But their rig is not what we would call a conventional setup. The number 2 case study is more conventional. It's based on the West Coast. It's relatively large scale in operation. It's hard to comment on the specific performance of, or the overall performance of the mussel farming as is. What we've done is we've documented them in order to provide feedback to the practitioners as to where their impact hotspots are. So they become aware of that. We've discussed how they can reduce their impacts, potentially improve their performance, and we're going to continue contact with them as we do more comparative assessments and downstream processing assessments. So we get eventually we'll get a full sort of industry-linked cradle to grave perspective compared to other seafoods. So it's very hard to answer your question, and it's difficult generally in LCA to compare fairly because each system is slightly different. The mussel farming results here that you're seeing from the West Coast include, multiple hours of cruising in a boat, of transporting biomass to and from, of monitoring and so on. The farms are spread out over multiple sites around the island of Orust and another island. So it's difficult to compare that to, say, the Ashidian site, which is relatively close to its port, where it's using a different vessel. It's So again, comparing apples and pears, it's very difficult to compare these things and comment. So if you had some specific questions on the mussel farming performance, Mercedes, please send me an email and I will we can discuss this, or I can reply to specific questions on that.
Great, thanks, thanks JB. And also there's another question that was to get your contact details. I'll put your email here in the chat in a little bit. But before that, I'll just give the words over to Phil, who's got a question. So Phil, just remember to unmute your mic. Thanks.
Yes, can you hear me, JB?
Yes, I can.
Very interesting talk, thank you. I think it really starts to shed light on a really complex issue, which is, as you mentioned, everyone talks about carbon neutrality and sequestering with growing macroalgae, but the subtleties of it are much more complex than people. I thought your example of freezing algae made it carbon neutral is a really good thing to take up, and also another really standout example was that the climate impact of algae was higher when you compare it with mussel and ascidians because of that hatchery phase. Really interesting stuff. My question is, you gave 4 quite separate case studies. If you have a case study where you're growing both ascidians, perhaps mussels and macroalgae on the same site, is it possible, I mean, this is a question of ignorance, is it still possible to do an LCA, and how accurate would it be, and how complex would it be, and is it really feasible at all?
I've not given IMTA LCAs much thought, but I would assume that each product would have a separate rig of sorts and slightly different harvesting and deployment timeframes and monitoring activities associated with each. What I would say is that if you were on the same site, you probably would have some synergies between the activities. I can't really answer as to what those would be. I've not given this question much thought in the past. But it's a tricky one to answer.
Do you think it would be possible? I guess would be my
I think one could pretty much always do an LCA as long as you have a product system like this, which is defined in one way or another, and you have good quality data on the materials that are being used, on all the inputs and outputs of the system, because that's the key thing. So if you've got good data on the yields and the data on the carbon content and biomass content of these different products, then I think you could do an LCA. I would also add one thing, that there are probably LCAs where in many ways it's still very much in its infancy when it comes to aquaculture. I mentioned this before. There are some things that we're still in the dark with regards to, and I suspect that within AquaVitae you probably have some people that are familiar with these questions, but we're not including certain things in this in these LCAs. For instance, the halocarbon emissions from seaweed through their life cycle, so we're not accounting for that. Also, there seems to be some discussion and debate in recent literature about carbon emissions from the shell formation processes in mussels and oysters and other shellfish. So there are still many things that are not accounted for in this LCA. It's quite a simple one, and the idea is it's a starting point with a focus on the producers, and as time progresses, and hopefully as I get a postdoc in the next year and a half or so, then I will dig into these issues in more detail and hopefully get case studies from abroad. I'm hoping to work with colleagues out in Maine and also in Norway and in Denmark and in the UK, where I have some contacts as well. So yeah.
That's a good sign to anyone watching who's in this field and interested in collaborating. Then get in touch with JB.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. So there's another question. There's actually a couple questions, and there's one from Björn who's asking, can you compare the ROI from, for example, algae or mussels to crops, animals on land, or comment on that at all?
I really hope so. I think Roy is I've done some energy return on investment studies in the past, and it just seems like an interesting indicator, quite controversial in LCA, to use such an indicator in an LCA like this. So it's a novelty. It's not done ordinarily, because usually you see cradle to grave studies with the full life cycle of these products assessed. The idea of using a cradle to gate study and then assessing only and comparing those performances and using an indicator like this return on investment it's not common. So I don't know about nutrient and carbon return on investments done in agricultural systems or for other products. One does find, though, these comparative charts where, for instance, you might see beef with the highest carbon impacts from all of the foods that are compared. And then you can see this sort of curve, and they're kind of ranked from worst performing to best performing food products. And you can see these curves. So these do exist, and there are methods in order to do this, but not using return on investment indicators, as far as I'm aware. These would be more simply using this sort of graph perspective here, where you'd have the kilograms of CO2 equivalent from cradle to market, or whatever it is, and then you would have that perspective presented that way and then ranked. Seafood often doesn't appear on these graphs, which is an interesting thing. And as a part of this new Blue Food Center at the Christinaberg Research Center on the West Coast, we have a key part of our work over the next 8 years is going to be to put seaweed and actually just all seafoods on this map to make sure that they're compared and understood relative to other sources of both calories and protein and other sort of nutritional aspects and health benefits.
That sounds like a good plan. And there's one more question from Ruben, who says, thanks a lot for such a great, good presentation. LCAs for seaweed aquaculture are increasing, but they are still quite scarce. What is your opinion about upgrading assessment, the assessment method to life cycle sustainability assessment?
I am fascinated by LCSA, which is how we often refer to it now. So for those of you that aren't familiar with life cycle sustainability assessment, LCA began as a method for environmental assessment, and it has evolved since then to account also for economics and life cycle costings. And also you can do social life cycle assessments, where you're looking at the social impacts of products and services across their life cycle. So these are 3 separate methods that have a lot of synergies and so on. And the idea of life cycle sustainability assessment is to try and combine all of these together. Now, as I mentioned, this Blue Food Center, we have other applications also in the pipeline that we're waiting for answers on. One of them was to the Swedish Research Council sometime last year. I can't remember the timeframes. OSA is involved in that one too. And we proposed to do just this for seafoods linked to the Blue Food Center. So the aim is we're going in this direction. And I totally agree that this would be a great perspective to bring to the table, especially comparing to other food products. But again, LCAs are quite tricky to compare. So there are some real difficult aspects. You can't just expect a social life cycle assessment made about beef production in the UK to have been based on the same methods and assumptions that your Swedish mussel social life cycle assessment will have been based on. So again, it's comparing things that might not have been given an even footing when the assessments were designed. So this is a very difficult thing. So life cycle sustainability assessment is still very much in its infancy. I would love to be involved in doing those types of studies. Again, if there's anybody watching this that works with LCSA, please, and you're interested in the idea of working on aquaculture LCSAs, please let me know, because we're writing applications with this idea and looking for people to collaborate with. But that is the future, hopefully, for a more robust understanding of the full impacts of product systems. So thank you for an interesting question. Also, I would add, the UN is working on a new project now where they're taking life cycle sustainability assessment, and instead of having impact categories like climate impacts and so on, they're converting these into impacts relating to the SDGs. So they have an SDG related output to the life cycle assessment. And this is a really interesting project. If you want more information on this, I believe it was OSA that initially shared it with me. I'm not sure. Or perhaps Frederica Ziegler from RISE. It was Frederica Ziegler from RISE, in Research Institutes of Sweden. But I can send you their first report of this project, which is available, and they're looking for case studies and partners to help develop this method.
Awesome, thanks a lot. Well, I think we've gone a little bit over time. We always promised this to only last about half an hour, but I think this was so interesting, and there were so many questions that came in that, let's just keep going. But the questions have run out, so if there's no question that's coming in now before we close, I'd like to just give you the last word, if you want, JB.
I probably said enough. If we're running out of time, I can end it here. But thank you for letting me present. Thanks again to OSA for for this, and of course, Emil, for organizing it. We had some technical difficulties yesterday, but thank you very much, and good luck with the project, which sounds very exciting. I'll be watching and looking for results.
Thanks a lot. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with the project, if you want more information, check out the website aquavitaeproject.eu. I'll put the link in the box to the right as well. And apart from that, I'd just like to say goodbye from me, and goodbye from Phil and from JB. Bye, everyone.